Hey friends, it sure feels like summer has arrived as we gather for another week of Table Talk. Today we turn to Psalm 129. Feel free to join along. Greatly have they afflicted me from my youth. Let Israel now say, greatly have they afflicted me from my youth. Yet they have not prevailed against me. The plowers plowed upon my back. They made long their furrows. There are two questions I want to ask today arising from Psalm 129. First, who does the psalmist mean by afflicted? And second, how does a righteous God deal with it? To the first question, I wonder if the psalmist has in mind those major milestones of affliction in Israel's history. That is, Egyptian slavery and the experience of exile. In both cases, Israel utterly relies on the Lord to act on their behalf. And this got me to thinking a bit this week about the afflicted in our own day who long for God's justice to be known. Those persons in communities in need of deliverance and restoration. I wonder, for example, how African American brothers and sisters in Christ would read Psalm 129, having alongside Israel the shared history of slavery and exile. Greatly have they afflicted me from my youth. The plowers plowed upon my back. The psalmist gives violent, even graphic imagery of affliction imposed by the wicked, who are the enemies of God. Over the last days and weeks, I've found it impossible to ignore the headlines revealing brutal acts of racial violence across the nation. One of my Young Life colleagues, Crystal Wright, was recently interviewed on a podcast where she offered insight into the challenging and even daunting realities of race in America, as well as her experience as a Black woman in ministry. Her wise and gracious guidance on such a charged topic is well worth your time. At one point in that conversation, Crystal shared that she views her calling as an ambassador of reconciliation. She was borrowing words of the Apostle Paul, which he used to implore the church in Corinth to be a gospel people in the age of Roman Empire and all that entailed. Which leads to our second question. How does a righteous God deal with a world where racism and violence and affliction show up in endless combinations? I mentioned that Crystal quoted from 2 Corinthians 5, where in that very same passage we discover the glorious claims of the gospel. For our sake, he made him, that is Jesus Christ, to be sin, who knew no sin, so that in him we might become the righteousness of God. As we move toward Pentecost Sunday, it's worth reflecting upon our call to be the Christ-shaped, spirit-formed community for the good of our neighbor and the life of the world. And since I've already cherry-picked a few excerpts from 2 Corinthians 5, let me close with how Paul begins that great passage as a way for us to live out the gospel wherever God has us today and in these days and weeks ahead. If anyone is in Christ, there is a new creation. The old has passed away. Behold, the new has come. And all this is from God, who through Christ reconciled us to himself and gave us the ministry of reconciliation.